Winter in eastern Oregon arrived before it was expected and lingered long after it was welcome. The cold did not announce itself with storms at first. It settled quietly into the soil, hardened the grasses into brittle wires, and threaded itself through the low juniper and the scattered settlements that had never grown into towns. The land held the cold the way it held memory, refusing to let go. Sarah Whitfield walked along what had once been a road. Its edges were no longer defined. Its direction suggested more by habit than by marks on the land. Wagon ruts and filled with frozen mud, and grass pushed through the places where wheels no longer passed. The wagon that had carried her west had broken down 2 days earlier. Its axle split beyond repair. The men driving it had unloaded the freight, redistributed what could be salvaged, and continued north with little conversation. They left her standing beside the stalled remains with a brief assurance that the next settlement was not far, an assurance offered lightly, as if distance were merely a matter of intention. She carried her belongings herself. The bag at her side was worn thin at the corners, its weight deceptively small and carefully balanced. Inside, wrapped against the damp, were letters she had read so many times the words had lost their edges. The handwriting in them was steady and confident, shaped by someone who believed in order and follow-through. The letters spoke of cleared land, of fence posts set straight, of a house built to last. They described the life that did not surprise its occupants. Once, those words had been enough to carry her across states. Now they rested in her bag like artifacts, heavy only because she could not yet bring herself to leave them behind. She walked slowly, aware of the limits of her body. Each step was measured, each pause intentional. She understood that a stumble did not only mean falling. It meant losing warmth, losing time, and possibly losing the narrow chance she still carried with her. The wind brushed across her coat and found every weakness in the fabric. Her boots were damp, the soles stiff with cold. She did not curse or hurry. She adjusted her pace to what the land demanded and kept moving. By the time the light began to fade, her legs trembled with fatigue that no longer responded to will. The sky had settled into a dull iron color, pressing low over the hills. It was then that she noticed the faintest sign that someone lived beyond the emptiness. A thin column of smoke rose against the horizon, distorted by the wind but undeniable. She stopped and watched it for a few long seconds, as if afraid that fixing her gaze on it too clearly would cause it to vanish. The house stood where the open hills gave way to a stand of sparse trees. It had been built with function in mind, its lines plain, and its roof pitched low against the weather. A corral sat nearby, half buried in snow, and the narrow path had been beaten from the door to the well. Everything about the place suggested persistence rather than comfort. Ethan Holloway noticed movement where none was expected. At first it registered as a change in the landscape, a disruption subtle enough that he assumed it was an animal. He stood near the fence he had been mending, the wire biting slightly into his gloves as he steadied it. He watched longer than necessary, narrowing his eyes as the shape separated itself from the shadows. The figure continued forward without urgency, swaying with a rhythm that was uneven but determined. It did not dart or hesitate the way wildlife did. It advanced in a straight line that spoke of intention rather than instinct. Ethan set aside his tools and stepped away from the fence, the sound of his boots muted by the snow. As he drew closer, the outline sharpened into a woman. Her posture remained upright through force of habit more than strength. Her face was pale beneath the grime and windburn, her mouth set in a line that had learned restraint. When she reached the edge of the path, her knees buckled and her weight pitched forward. He reached her without haste and without hesitation. His hand closed around her arm, firm enough to hold, steady enough not to bruise. She did not pull away. Her body yielded, not in surrender, but in relief that bordered on exhaustion too deep to acknowledge. He did not speak. He merely adjusted his grip and kept her upright, anchoring her where she stood until the shaking in her legs slowed. The cold continued around them, indifferent and patient. Snow shifted beneath their boots. The house waited behind him, unchanged by the arrival of anyone new. Ethan turned them both towards it and guided her forward, step by careful step, as if this were the most ordinary act in the world.
Warmth returned to her before orientation did. It arrived first as a sensation rather than a place, seeping slowly through numbed limbs and stiff joints. When Sarah opened her eyes, the ceiling above her was low and darkened by years of smoke, the beams thick and unadorned. The walls were rough-hewn, their grain visible even in the dim light, and everything around her bore the mark of use rather than decoration. There was order in the room, not the kind meant to impress, but the kind that came from repetition and necessity. Each item had a reason to be where it was, and nothing existed without purpose. She lay still, listening to the small sounds of the house as if they might tell her how long she had been there. The fire crackled softly somewhere beyond her sight. A kettle gave off a faint metallic sigh as it cooled. She became aware of a blanket pulled up to her chest, heavy and smelling faintly of wood smoke and wool. The warmth unsettled her more than the cold had. It reminded her how much she had already accepted from someone she did not know. The discomfort she felt was not rooted in weakness. Her strength was returning, slow but steady. It came instead from the awareness that she occupied space that belonged to someone else. The bed beneath her, the roof above her head, the air she now breathed freely, had all been claimed long before her arrival. She folded her hands together, careful not to shift more than she needed to, as though stillness might reduce her presence. Ethan returned to his work almost immediately. He did not linger by the doorway or watch for signs of her waking. He moved through the house with the same economy he applied to everything else, checking the fire, setting down a bowl of food, filling a tin cup of water and leaving it within her reach. He placed his old coat nearby, the fabric worn thin at the elbows, and then stepped back outside without ceremony. He carried himself as if her presence had already been sorted into its proper place, temporary, contained, and requiring no explanation. He did not ask for anything, and in that absence she found an unexpected relief. There was no demand placed on her to justify staying or to promise leaving. The silence allowed her to gather herself without scrambling for words that would have rung hollow even to her own ears. As the days passed, a rhythm settled over the house. Sarah began to move again, cautiously at first, then with more confidence as her strength returned. She repaired small tears in her clothing using thread found carefully coiled in a tin kept near the stove. She helped with the preparation of meals, learning where utensils were stored and how supplies were managed without ever opening a drawer that felt too personal. Her movements were deliberate, respectful, measured in a way that acknowledged boundaries without the need for them to be spoken. Ethan worked outside from dawn until the light failed. He mended fence lines where the winter wind had weakened posts. He checked on the livestock with a practiced eye, adjusting feed and shelter where needed. At times, he stood still for long stretches, gazing toward the distant horizon where the land rose and fell in muted shades of brown and white. Those moments carried a weight that suggested more than rest. They hinted at calculation, at patience learned through solitude. When he returned inside, he did so quietly, stamping snow from his boots and hanging his coat in the same place each time. He acknowledged her presence with a brief glance, nothing more. Yet he always knew where she was, not because he watched her, but because he understood the house the way a person understands their own breath. Her movements became part of its awareness, accepted, but never examined. They did not grow closer, nor did they pull away from each other. The space between them remained intact, carefully preserved. It was not empty. It held an unspoken expectation, a sense that something waited to be decided. Neither of them attempted to define it. For now, it was enough that the roof held firm against the cold. The fire continued to burn, and each day ended without requiring an explanation for why the other was still there.
Strength returned to Sarah, gradually. Not in declarations, but in small confirmations. She found she could stand longer without resting her hand against the table. Her breath no longer caught when she climbed the short ladder to the loft. The cold lost its sharpest edge against her skin. With that strength came the impulse to look again at the things she had carried across the land. She took out the letters one evening when the light still lingered by the window. She laid them flat, smoothing the creases with careful fingers. At first, they read as they always had, their tone steady, their promises measured. Then, the irregularities began to surface. Dates overlapped in ways they should not have. Town names shifted slightly from one page to the next. A hand altered its slant, subtle enough to miss, but undeniable once seen. The hand that had once seemed reliable now revealed the marks of more than one writer. The future, described in ink, did not belong to a single man. It belonged to a process. The realization settled without drama. There were no tears, no outward signs of shock. What filled her instead was a broad, quiet emptiness, the kind that followed understanding too complete to resist. She had not been chosen. She had been moved, directed, placed where convenience allowed. The marriage promised to her had never been anchored in mutual intention. It had been a transaction, and she had been one of its numbers. She folded the letters again, not with care this time, but with detachment. When she returned them to her bag, they felt lighter, stripped of the meaning she had once assigned them. She did not burn them or tear them apart. She simply let them be what they were. Ethan noticed the change before she named it even to herself. He saw it in the way her gaze lingered without focus, in the deliberate calm that replaced earlier caution. He recognized that look. He had seen it on men who had lost property through legal language they barely understood, on women who had buried futures alongside the dead and stood up without protest. It was the look of someone who had been relieved of expectation. His own life had broken along different lines. No contracts had been involved, no promises written down, yet the result had been similar. Something taken without permission,
something not returned. Without marking the shift, he began to alter the household in small, nearly invisible ways. He kept the lamp lit longer into the evening. He repaired a second cot that had remained folded against the wall for years, mending its joints even though no one had asked for it. He organized the work so that tasks once done alone now fell naturally into shared sequence. There was no announcement of these changes. They simply appeared, like adjustments made for weather. Their connection did not announce itself as emotion. It did not ask for recognition. It formed instead. The town lay under a pale winter sun that did little to warm the streets or the people who moved through them. Sarah walked beside Ethan, her steps careful, measured, as though each one could leave a mark that might betray the fragility beneath her composure. The legal offices smelled of ink and cold wood, and the clerk's eyes lingered on her hands, roughened by travel, before turning back to the papers with a practiced indifference. Every signature, every stamp reminded her that the life she had imagined had never existed, that the promises carried in the letters were nothing more than shadows of someone else's intentions. The words that once held weight now felt hollow, like the echo of wind through empty hills. Ethan's presence beside her was silent, yet deliberate, as if his body formed a barrier between her and the scrutiny of the world. He did not speak, did not offer explanations or apologies, but his hand, occasionally brushing against the small of her back, was steady, grounding. Each step back to the carriage was an unspoken agreement. They would face the consequences together. The road home stretched long, the cold biting, but Sarah felt the weight of being accompanied lessen the ache of exposure. People turned their heads as they passed, whispers riding the edges of the wind, and Ethan did not flinch. The journey back was measured in silence and the sound of horses' hooves against frozen dirt, each moment reinforcing the unspoken decision they had made. By the time the familiar hills and sparse forests appeared on the horizon, the town's scrutiny felt distant, like a storm that had passed without touching them directly. Ethan guided the carriage up the rough slope, never hurrying, never faltering, and Sarah understood that safety, when earned through action rather than promise, could be more enduring than any paper or law. The house welcomed them with its quiet order, the faint smoke curling from the chimney, a small reassurance that the world outside could be weathered, faced, and survived. In that space, choices were made not with words, but with persistence, endurance, and the unshakable presence of another who refused to abandon what mattered. Sarah stepped inside, the door closing behind her with a finality that carried no regret, only the knowledge that some actions, once taken, defined the boundaries of life more clearly than any law could. Ethan moved among the rooms with routine familiarity, tending to tasks as if to declare that the household remained under his control. But the edges of his attention always returned to her. They did not speak of the day's events, did not recount the judgment they had endured, but their coexistence carried the weight of understanding. Outside, winter pressed down on the hills and the fields, indifferent and relentless. Yet inside the house, the presence of two people who chose to face it together rendered it something to endure rather than fear. Each night the hearth glowed with steady warmth, the silence filled with quiet acknowledgement, and the rhythm of chores and small acts of care created a fragile but unspoken alliance. Sarah moved through the home with cautious familiarity, aware that she was no longer entirely alone, yet conscious that freedom had to be rebuilt step by step in a landscape where every choice had consequences. Ethan's hands, scarred and steady, repaired what needed repair, checked what needed checking, and in each movement he offered a kind of protection that required neither gratitude nor words. Their days were filled with repetition and small adjustments, each task a brick in the structure of something new. When night fell and the wind rattled the thin windows, they sat separately, yet near, each tracing the shape of the other's presence in the quiet. The law had failed Sarah. The town had doubted her, and yet she had survived. With Ethan, the world's judgment felt contained, manageable, as if by bearing it together, they could endure anything. The days stretched long, measured not by sunlight, but by the rhythm of survival and the steady pulse of living with someone who did not abandon you when the outside world turned its gaze against you. In that acceptance, silent and deliberate, Sarah found a foundation she had not known she needed, and Ethan discovered a commitment born not of duty, but of recognition. Some responsibilities, once taken on, could not be undone, and facing the world together offered its own quiet redemption. The thaw came slowly, melting the edges of winter, but leaving the ground uneven and treacherous. The first hints of green pushed through the brown, brittle grass, and the air carried a sharp promise of change. It was then that the man arrived, riding a horse that left deep tracks in the thawing soil, his presence a stark reminder that the past had not been left behind. He brought papers, letters, and the weight of claims that had no concern for fairness, only for leverage. Sarah watched him from the doorway, her hands clasped together, the warmth of the house failing to reach the chill that accompanied his words. Ethan stood behind her, tall and steady, and though his expression betrayed nothing, every line of his body spoke of calculation, of measured restraint. The demands were clear. Compliance would ensure safety. Resistance would invite loss. Ethan's response was neither argument nor plea. He moved with certainty, arranging what was necessary with the quiet authority of someone who had endured far worse and understood the limits of negotiation. Coins exchanged hands, papers were signed, and the transaction left a hollow space behind it. Money and legal guarantees did not guarantee peace, only temporary relief. The cost was immediate and visible. Stores of supplies diminished, the feeling of invincibility vanished, and the knowledge that their security rested on fragile agreements settled heavily over them. Sarah felt the shift acutely, a subtle alteration in how she perceived herself and her surroundings. She was no longer a visitor, no longer simply someone rescued. She was entwined, bound by choices she had not sought, but now could not evade. The home reflected this new reality. Tasks once routine became shared responsibilities, the rhythm of labor more intentional, the division of duties a silent pact. Rooms were cleaned not just for comfort, but for efficiency, and storage areas organized with foresight rather than convenience. The hearth burned steadily, not as a symbol of welcome, but as a marker of resilience, each flame a deliberate effort to endure. Outside, the land demanded attention. Fences repaired, gates reinforced, livestock tended with precision that left no room for error. Each act of maintenance carried weight, a reminder that survival required vigilance and that lapses had consequences. Sarah learned to move through the house and the property with purpose, anticipating needs, preparing for contingencies, and understanding the fragile balance that now defined her existence. Ethan's presence was constant, but unobtrusive, a steadying force that allowed her to act with independence while knowing the outcome would not be left to chance. Their relationship, unspoken and measured, grew in layers of shared labor and mutual acknowledgement rather than conversation. The silence between them became a space for observation, understanding, and adaptation. Nights were long and quiet, filled with the faint crackle of the hearth and the whisper of wind against the roof. Each evening, Sarah catalogued her day's actions, recognizing that endurance was not a state of being, but a sequence of deliberate choices. Ethan reviewed the property with methodical attention, checking fences, water troughs, and grain stores, ensuring that every element of their existence remained functional. The land itself demanded this vigilance, revealing hidden weaknesses as the snow melted, exposing frozen roots and soft ground. Through these actions, Sarah and Ethan built a new understanding of strength. It was not born from escape or luck, but from persistence, foresight, and the willingness to accept responsibility without complaint. With each passing day, the past loomed less as a shadow and more as a cautionary guide. Threats had been neutralized, but their memory lingered in small gestures, in locked doors, in the careful accounting of resources. The home, once a temporary refuge, had been transformed into a symbol of enduring will. Sarah no longer measured herself by what she had lost, but by what she could protect, maintain, and sustain alongside Ethan. And in that sustained effort, in the quiet, unglamorous labor of everyday survival, a fragile sense of permanence began to take root. A recognition that resilience was costly, but it could be bought with deliberate action, shared vigilance, and the unspoken commitment to endure together.
Spring arrived in Oregon quietly, its approach measured, testing the land and those who lived upon it. The frost retreated slowly from the hollows and the ridges, leaving behind damp earth and the first shoots of green. Sarah moved through the fields with attentive hands and careful steps, learning the subtle signals of the soil, how the moisture settled, where the sun struck longest, which areas would yield first and which would resist until later. She discovered the patience required not only of the land but of herself. That endurance was reflected in observation, in timing, in quiet action repeated day after day. Ethan worked alongside her, not to instruct but to coexist, sharing space once held solely by habit, negotiating boundaries and routines without speaking of them. His movements were deliberate, measured, a silent agreement that each had a place, each had responsibilities, and that their survival and comfort depended on the unseen understanding that had grown between them. The house, once a refuge against cold and wind, had become a base of continuity. Its walls carried the marks of care and repair. The hearth burned steadily. The windows framed the changing sky, and every room reflected not just shelter, but intention, deliberate and unyielding. They did not mark their union with words or ceremony. No formal acknowledgments existed to announce it to the world. Their alliance was a matter of action, a commitment built from shared labor, shared vigilance, and the willingness to endure alongside one another. The neighbors, scattered across the hills and sparse settlements, observed cautiously at first, uncertain of the newcomer and of the quiet man who had accepted her presence without hesitation. Over time, the steady rhythm of their days, the visible effort to maintain the land and the home, spoke louder than words. Slowly, suspicion turned into recognition, distance into acceptance, and the house became a point of reference, a place one could approach without explanation or apology. They took on responsibilities larger than anticipated and smaller than the world demanded, allowing them to act without the burden of external expectation, carving out space for resilience and choice. Each day followed its own logic, simple routines repeated with precision,
small acts of care accumulating into a life that was neither dramatic nor spectacular, but solid, sustainable, and self-determined. Sarah found purpose in tending the soil, observing growth, and planning for the cycles ahead, while Ethan found satisfaction in continuity, in the quiet assertion of stability, in the shared labor that required no applause. Their partnership, forged in necessity and tempered by circumstance, grew into a quiet force, evident in the way chores were divided, in the way the land was monitored, and the unspoken respect for each other's presence. They no longer measured themselves by what they had lost or by what the world expected of them.
Instead, they measured the ground beneath their feet, the stability of walls, the consistency of light and water, and the steady rhythm of shared work. The story did not conclude with relief, celebration, or dramatic triumph. It ended in the unremarkable, unglamorous victory of endurance. In the firm soil beneath their boots, in a home that was no longer temporary, in a life that no longer required escape. Where once there had been a road without end, there was now a foundation, solid, steady, and capable of supporting everything they had chosen to carry forward. This was a life shaped by intention, by resilience, by the quiet power of two people building a world together from the fragments of what remained. For more stories of endurance, love, and life on the frontier, follow and subscribe to Dust and Devotion Tales, where each tale uncovers the strength found in the smallest, most steadfast choices.